going to rely heavily. Thank you. The meeting is being recorded tonight. So the meeting procedures for tonight are going to be heavily through the chat. So we are going to be running a presentation. The comments and questions that you have can be submitted in the chat, and you should be able to find that toward the bottom of your screen. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it looks like a little word bubble. It says chat underneath, and you should be, at any point, feel free to drop in questions. We're going to try to answer the questions in the chat as we do the presentation, but there may be some that we just take at the end, depending on how fast the presentation goes. The purpose of this meeting, as we said, is to talk about sort of an overview of the existing and proposed stormwater articles in the UDO, and then get into the questions that you all have about those articles. So if you've been to a presentation, one of these conversations before, you've seen this slide a dozen times, but it's always good to sort of take a step back and answer the question of why are we doing a UDO, or Unified Development Ordinance? The main reason is that we are creating the primary regulatory tool for the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The comprehensive plan is the vision. It sets out key policies and sort of guiding statements about where we want to go as a city. And the UDO sets regulations which are required of developers or real estate professionals who are developing land in Charlotte. By updating and creating a UDO, we create more predictability for future development for the development industry and for the neighborhoods. We're aligning development regulations with each other so that they can work together. Updating based on best practices, consolidating regulations. Today, we have dozens of regulations spread across several articles or several ordinances, and consolidating them and combining them is definitely a major goal that we have of creating this UDO. In general, we think that the UDO is more user-friendly. It is still a long document. If you've opened up the UDO, it's 608 pages, but that is significantly fewer pages than what you will read today. And then in addition, we like to mention that we are working to comply with some North Carolina enabling legislation that we are required to follow as a municipality in North Carolina, and that's the 160D state statute. So in terms of the UDO content, we always like to take this time to run through the fact that the UDO has provisions for zoning, which are your land uses and your development standards. We have standards for subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. And then really where you're going to find all the articles that we'll talk about tonight is in the stormwater and natural resources section of the UDO. Now that includes mostly stormwater articles, but it also includes our tree protection article in that section of the UDO. The final section of the UDO is on administration and enforcement, and that's really the section where we talk about the process and variances and how folks can appeal rules or decisions in the development process. The key dates that we'd like to tell everyone about are included on this slide. We are in the first phase of UDO, the first draft engagement, which will run through January. And the big date to keep in mind here is July of 2022. We are eyeing that as the UDO adoption date. At that time, we'll take this before council, and hopefully all of the questions and the concerns and the sort of revisions to the UDO will be completed over the next 6 months, or 7 months. And then in terms of how we're coming up with these standards, it's important to note that everything that is included in the UDO is in some form following city council adopted policy. One of those main policies was adopted in June of 2021. You'll see it there. The Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan has all of the policy guidance for growth and development that are being incorporated and referenced as we write standards for the UDO. And kind of what you see here is a list of all of the ordinances that are in our existing codes, and what we'll be talking about today. So post-construction stormwater, floodplain, and erosion control, erosion and sedimentation control are all included in the code of ordinances. And then in the zoning regulations today, we have swim buffers and water supply, watershed protection standards. Those are coming out of the zoning ordinances and into a separate stormwater article, or as a separate stormwater article. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those in the presentation tonight. And then in addition, there's some flood study requirements in subdivision. A lot of that is getting moved into the drainage article, which is a new article of the UDO, which we will talk about in a minute here. Okay, so with that, we're going to get into water supply, watershed protection, and I'll hand it over to Robbie Zink from our stormwater team.
Good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Robbie Zink with Stormwater's Land Development Program Manager. So glad to be here tonight, and sorry for y'all, I'm the fill-in presenter. Hopefully this will go pretty good. If you're not familiar with water supply watersheds, they are the areas over near Lake Wylie and the Catawba River that are meant to protect our drinking water supply and actually the people downstream of us. So as you can see from this map, they are along the Catawba River. There's three. Two of these are regulated or enforced by the state, or regulated by the state. And the last one, which is Lower Lake Wylie, that one is a local ordinance. But all of those were in the zoning ordinance and will now be moved over to the UDO. As you can see, they've had some different effective dates over the years, and the requirements within those areas, there's built upon area, or you can think of it as impervious, or buildings and parking lots and driveways limits in that area. Once you go above certain percentages, you do have to do some stormwater control to treat the runoff off of a development. And there's also buffer requirements in those areas. So the potential key changes for this is one, moving it from the zoning ordinance to the stormwater and natural resources section of the UDO. It will combine all the watersheds into one article. If you go to the zoning ordinance now, each of those areas are in three separate articles, and a lot of the same languages in each one. So we're kind of combining them together. Also, to make it a little easier to read, we are converting some of the text to tables and cleaning up some of the language and definitions throughout. Here's just an example of where we've took some of the text information and brought it over into table format to hopefully make that a little bit more user friendly. All right, thank you.
All right, so the drainage regulations are next. I'm Kate Labrador. Thank you for joining us this evening. The types of development we're seeing in Charlotte have changed from large planned subdivisions to infill, and our current drainage requirements are not adequate to catch and address these issues. And so we are finding more development related issues and are receiving more development related calls. Next slide. Currently, subdivisions, commercial, multifamily, those kinds of development come through and are reviewed for storm drainage. But your smaller developments, your infill, your single lot developments, small minor subdivisions, these infill type developments don't currently come through for review. Next slide. And that's causing us some concerns. What we're seeing is a lot more calls. Over the last 2 years, we've received over 200 calls that are either a drainage issue from a development or property owner calling with concerns about what's happening on an adjacent property and their drainage related to that development. So specifically, some of the calls and some of the issues we're seeing are where developments modified the city drainage system, either removing or modifying pipes or catch basins or tying into our system. New structures, buildings, additions, pools are being built within existing drainage easements and sometimes over pipes and drainage systems, which makes maintenance of these systems extremely difficult and costly. We're seeing the installation of inadequate systems or poor construction methods being used, which are causing additional maintenance and flooding concerns. Driveway locations are often not thought about early on, and so then they'll get put in conflict with a storm drainage, like a catch basin or something in the road, and so the catch basin will be removed or something to make way for the driveway. And then we're also seeing new structures that are having flooding issues and developing properties in ways that create flooding concerns. And then the last thing is that with this infill, land is becoming more and more scarce, and land that has historically not been developed because it's in low-lying areas or floodplain areas are getting developed, and that's a difficult place from a drainage perspective to build and develop. Next slide. So here's the outline for the drainage section. The meat of it is in the storm drainage standards with the encroachments, the runoff and conveyance, the flooding, and the easements. And so with the next couple of slides, we're just going to highlight some of the proposed changes. Next slide. Listing, so it'll have the current ordinance, our proposed change, and then a reference to where in the UDO you can go and look for more information. Excuse me. So the current ordinance for your subdivisions, your multifamilies, your commercials, we see plans, we know what's going on before building starts. So we're able to check to make sure that there's not any easement encroachments and that kind of stuff. We're proposing to have that same type of review to check to see, is this house or something being proposed over a drainage easement or over a pipe system, something like that. Also, to allow for a review process if someone wants to tie into the city system of what they're doing, how they're tying in, making sure that they're not creating an unintended consequence. Next slide. So in this case, currently subdivisions, multifamily, commercial, again, the drainage that's being proposed is checked. You know, it's looked for to make sure that it's adequate and how it's being sized and all that kind of stuff. We don't see the smaller developments, so we're not able to do that same kind of review. And so for the smaller developments, if they're proposing to modify or install new drainage and it's conveying runoff from a public street, we want to have that same kind of look to make sure that what's being done is adequate. The other thing is that drainage has to have a place to drain. And so right now your subdivisions and stuff provide those areas, those easement areas. We're looking for similar protections on the smaller developments. Next slide. And then this is the last slide. So subdivisions right now in the areas that are flood prone have to establish stormwater protection elevation lines, areas where they don't want finished floor buildings and things where people will live. We want to give that protection so that those areas don't flood. This change is just taking that same approach, that same level of protection, and trying to apply it to the smaller sites. So in those flood prone areas, we want to have that same look of is this new building being built, steer it away from those flood prone areas. So, and that is all I've got. And so I will hand it back over to Robbie.
All right, thank you, Kate. So the next section is the Post-Construction Stormwater Ordinance. The purpose of this ordinance, if you're not aware of it, is to control pollution and kind of reduce runoff. And it's directly a result of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit that the city has under the Clean Water Act. Next slide. So the overview is, to protect and maintain and enhance the public health, safety, and environment by minimizing the impact from stormwater runoff, which is a non-point source pollution from development. And one other thing you'll notice kind of maybe as we talk here is there's a key term called built upon area. Like I think I mentioned before in the watershed, this means impervious or partially impervious materials, including gravel, concrete, rooftops, and pavement. Next slide. So the potential key changes, see the current ordinance is the applicability triggers are different based on commercial and residential. Today, a commercial property has to start treating their runoff once they reach 20,000 square feet. A residential lot has to start treating most of the time once they're at 24% of a lot. So that based on the lot size that triggers it. So currently a residential lot that's 20,000 square foot could only put less than 5,000 square feet before it triggers the ordinance. So our proposal is to make these the same. So our commercial and residential would both be 5,000 square feet trigger. The next one is, redevelop BUA, built upon area requires stormwater controls. This was changed as a result of state law that was passed in 2018. We've been doing this, but we had to officially change it in the ordinance when we changed it. So say existing built upon area that's out there now, somebody goes out and develops it, redevelops it, tears it down, builds it back. Previously, they had to do some stormwater requirements on those sites, and as a result of that state law, we cannot do that anymore. So we are removing those sections from the ordinance. And also there's a natural area section in post-construction ordinance. Those natural area kind of requirements related to trees are all going to be moved to the tree section of the UDO. Currently in the post-construction ordinance, there are mitigation options for different geographical areas of the city and redevelopment areas. The proposed change will mean that all on-site compliance is for all sites are the same throughout the city. So if you're familiar with the ordinance, those remove sections 18-61A, B, and C. Also, industrial zoned areas currently have some different requirements a little bit. In a move for consistency, we are going to change those to all be the same as well. Next, there is a portion of stormwater detention rules that are currently in the zoning ordinance. Those are for flood risk reduction. We're going to move that or kind of weave it into the new post-construction ordinance. Right. I'll go back quickly just for a minute. If you can go back one, sorry, Andrew. Just to mention on the site where the very top one where we're doing away with the mitigation options. Yep. One of the reasons is the areas that get these mitigation options are a lot of times our interior kind of core of the city, which are already paved anyway. Since the state eliminated that option for us to require treatment for those areas when they redevelop, there's really no benefit to keep adding that, and it's leave those mitigation options out there. So next slide, I'm sorry. All right, currently the city can accept maintenance of stormwater control measures within single family developments. After 2 years, the proposed change is all private stormwater control measures will be maintained by the property owners or the association. And the next one is related to buffers that are required through the ordinance. In the current ordinance, all impacts to water quality buffers are allowed with mitigation, except for in 6 Mile Creek, which is kind of the southeast portion of the county. And we would like to change the placement of BUA in water quality buffers is allowed, but it's got to be 15 feet away from any stream bank. Next slide. This next one is stormwater, or the swim buffer ordinance. So it's stormwater buffers on all creeks. There's not really many changes to this, I don't think, but so the importance of stream buffers is they protect water quality by filtering pollutants, and they provide storage for floodwaters and provide habitats for wildlife and allow groundwater recharge. So the swim buffer ordinance became effective in 1999. It applies to all intermittent and perennial streams that drain less than 100 acres, and they have varying widths depending on where you are in that kind of drainage basin. So here's another example of just how the swim buffers work. There's a stream side zone that's right next to the creek. That's one of the most important parts. There's a managed use zone and an upland zone, and there's varying types of things you can do in each of those zones. So potential key changes, again, are moving it from the zoning ordinance to the stormwater and natural resources section. It removes some of the older exemptions that are in the ordinance, but really those are redundant and they're outdated and they're no longer used anymore. So it doesn't really make sense to keep them in there. Again, cleaning up of the language and definitions throughout and aligning it with other stream buffer regulations where applicable, like the post-construction has some buffer requirements as well. And it's removing some underused and outdated buffer mitigations. Like Jordan Miller, who's the administrator of this, we're just removing the ones that don't get used. And the last one was the floodplain regulations, which there's no major changes with the UDO. It was recently updated just last, I think in December, it was adopted by council. And no major changes to the soil and sedimentation erosion control ordinance.
Thanks, Robbie. So I don't think I saw any questions come in as we were presenting, but folks are welcome to, I'd say either drop questions into the chat or raise your hand if you're able to do that through Zoom, and we'll allow you to unmute. I think we have a reasonable enough crowd where we could do something like that if you have a question you want to ask. But we had a couple of stock questions that were not stock questions. They were questions that were asked by people who registered for the meeting tonight. And so I wanted to take those on, and as we're answering those questions, maybe folks can continue to drop stuff into the chat, but I will put them into the chat as I ask them. But the first question is, what are the most recent changes in the flood zone regulations? And I read that to mean the floodplain regulations. So if the person who asked that question is on the call tonight, feel free to correct me, but does anybody want to talk about the most recent changes to the floodplain regulations?
Hey, Andrew, this is Daryl Hammett with Stormwater Services. I can just tell you that in December, City Council did make a change to the floodplain ordinance. The main goal of it was to reduce flood losses to homes and businesses that are built in the floodplain by causing those newer buildings and structures to be elevated at a higher height, I guess, up above the flood level. And so what was done was there was a temporary provision put in there that any new structure that is built in the floodplain be raised in elevation by an additional 1 foot over what is required today. That was the main change. There was a couple other secondary changes. One of them was to codify the conditions of a petitioner who wanted to sort of get a different, basically codify the conditions that would be needed to satisfy a variance request, and basically not have to actually physically go through a variance. So the rules of the variance have been codified in the ordinance, particularly around a dry land access requirement of the floodplain ordinance and a parking lot requirement of the floodplain ordinance. So now there'll be a lot fewer, if any, variances related to those two items. So those were the changes.
Thanks. The other question that we had that was submitted as we were registering, people were registering, was how do we make stormwater areas on new development more attractive? The comment is they always look like dirty puddles. So any thoughts on that in terms of, are there ways that we in the ordinance can do that? Is that, how does that work? And can somebody dive into that a little bit?
This is Robbie Zink. I would say we haven't addressed really that in the ordinance, and through stormwater regulations, we really haven't gotten to aesthetics before. It's more of how does it function? Does it meet our design requirements? So
yeah,
it's really kind of up to the developer and whoever's maintaining them. That's always a big key to the dirty puddle issue as well. So it's really where we've kind of left that up to, because it's, I think from a stormwater perspective, it's hard for us to kind of regulate the aesthetics of it.
Thanks, Robbie. Are there any other questions or things we want to discuss? Any questions about stuff in the presentation? Trying to see if anybody's hands raised. I don't see anybody. Do we want to talk a little bit? I thought, Daryl, I thought at the noon session, you had a good point that you brought up. It may be helpful for those on the call, talking sort of about how development's changing in Charlotte and maybe how the ordinances today regulate really kind of large forms of development. And we're really trying to get at something different in these ordinances and what we're seeing and why we're doing that. That was a really good comment that these folks may benefit from hearing too.
Yeah, I'll just say the stormwater program is focused on ordinances that prevent flooding or reduce flooding to the extent they can. Make sure that homes and businesses are built where they won't flood. And it's also focused on keeping creeks and lakes as clean as possible and making sure that they're very healthy and they're natural and they are natural, desirable places to recreate. But as development has evolved in the last 30 years in Charlotte, we used to get these larger big subdivisions with 50 or 100 or 200 homes or more, and they came in as really big developments. But as everyone will know these days, a lot of developments are maybe two houses and maybe you'd have a single lot and it's subdivided into two pieces, two parcels, and there's two homes built. There's a whole lot of that going on. And so what's happening is impervious surfaces are being built, and that increases flooding problems. Homes are being placed sometimes where they're in harm's way. Maybe they're too close to a creek or a ditch and they get flooded. And it's not helping our surface water quality situation either, because the runoff from those homes and those land uses impacts creeks and surface water. So we're just seeing a big change in the development patterns in Charlotte in the last 10 years or so. And some of our ordinances are aimed at trying to prevent problems. That's a lot of what we're trying to do, is just make sure that no new problems get created, because someone has to ultimately pay to fix those problems.
Yeah. It's really good. It's really important, I think, to look at it from that level. So thanks for sharing that. I don't see any other questions, but what we'll do is we'll go to our next slide. And if there are questions that folks want to ask, feel free to drop them into the chat. These virtual conversations have been really beneficial for us as city staff. And we hope that they've been beneficial. We've heard that folks have really enjoyed them. So we're going to continue the engagement in this sort of virtual conversation format through January 27th. The big update here is that we have rescheduled the session that was originally planned for yesterday, January 4th. We're going to move that to January 27th. That session was scheduled to be a sort of, we're calling it a frequent users question and answer. And that's really to offer some time for folks who use the development regulations with any form of regularity to really ask the detailed questions and ask maybe some site specific questions, things that they don't really know, they don't really understand in the UDO. We understand that there's a lot of education that has to be done on new standards, even though there are some things that are being carried over from the ordinances today. There are a lot of new concepts that maybe folks need to ask questions and need help understanding. So that session is really to get into the details and work with developers and real estate professionals, but we just didn't get enough questions to warrant an hour-long presentation. So we're moving that back to the 27th. Those registration links are available. You can register for a noon session or a 6 o'clock session. Registration is required to participate, and we ask, if you do register, to include a question or two about why, or sort of what you want us to discuss, or what you have some confusion about, to really help push along that conversation. You can find all of this at charlotteudo.org. If you have any issues or you want to submit a comment through email, you can reach us at charlotteudo@charlottenc.gov. Any question, comment that's submitted there, we'll get you directed to the right place. So thank you, Yolanda, for dropping that into the chat. And I think that's it. Let me see, let me stop sharing. Are there any other closing thoughts or questions? I don't have a problem ending a meeting early. I just want to make sure that everybody has a chance to get their questions in there. But if not, we thank you all for coming tonight. Feel free to connect with us offline or through any of our online channels, but we appreciate your time and hopefully this is beneficial. Thanks everybody for coming.